Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. And this is my third time here in Luxembourg. I'm very delighted to be here. But my presentation today is going to be quite a grim story, I'm afraid. You got some introduction from Annika about what's going on in Estonia. And this particularly is quite a new topic to me. I was quite annoyed at what's happening in Estonia in terms of how our authorities and government is talking about veganism. And so I decided to analyze in depth the new nutrition guidelines that are going to be actually published in any day now. And I've been analyzing the working version so far. So I'm going to introduce you to some of the main things in this document. And so this presentation is based on a book chapter that I wrote, and this is going to be published hopefully next year in a collection of collection of essays in a book titled Capitalism and Animal Oppression. So the aim is to study how speciesist values and capitalist interests shape the making of dietary guidelines. And so the questions are, how is the need to consume other animals constructed, and how is veganism depicted? So some of the things I'll be looking at. And just a bit of background. So as you know here quite well, I guess, so there are, especially in recent years, some very prominent international organizations such as the UN, WHO and World Cancer Research Fund. So they have called for the reduction or even elimination of meat from diets for health and environmental reasons primarily. And also there's a group of Australian researchers who have recently written like a manifesto or essay where they kind of talk about this concept of interspecies sustainability, where they say that institutions should support sustainable food practices. And in their article, they talk particularly about schools and other institutions as well. And so this is an expanded definition of sustainability that also includes animal ethics, interspecies sustainability. So, well, these recommendations by these international organizations have been actually followed by many Western countries already. And so increasingly we see that in national dietary guidelines, veganism is being accepted, and even advice is given to vegans how to like have a viable diet, which is nutritionally adequate. But then there are some countries apparently that are moving in the opposite direction, and so Estonia is unfortunately one of them. So just before I go further to talk about the guidelines, there are some key concepts and kind of perspectives I wanted to shortly introduce. So the broad framework in which I'm working in is critical animal studies. So maybe some of you have heard that this is a kind of academic research area, and it's quite new. I'm trying to introduce it in Estonia, in sociology and in social sciences in my university and to my colleagues, but it's quite marginal still in the world. And so this is a kind of like activism in the academy and universities. So we want to do research in a way that we care about the material conditions of animals, not just talking about them as some interesting symbols, as many academics do. So we are actually trying to be committed to challenging animal exploitation through our research. Then the concept of speciesism, I'm sure that actually you know what that is quite well, and so this is valuing and treating beings differently according to their species membership. And so we can draw parallels between forms of oppression among human beings, such as sexism and racism. And particularly in my work in this analysis, the role of language is really important. So with language, we can, create and uphold relations of oppression and dominance. So language is always political, has political effects, and we can study how domination over animals and human beings is constructed through language. And I've been finding critical discourse analysis very useful. So through this kind of perspective, I've studied these guidelines. Okay, so just a bit about the Estonian context. You heard earlier from Annika, she gave a good overview of how actually the vegan movement is growing. So we are quite a small country, but so the vegan and animal rights movements are increasingly vocal, and the number of vegans is growing. But at the same time, we have a situation where we have an almost universal condemnation of veganism by the health and nutrition establishment. So we have got scientists, including some leading nutritionists in the country, who are working closely with the animal industry. So they are also receiving funding to produce some biotechnologies. For example, healthy dairy products. Yeah, and so there's a center which is called Biocompetence Center for Healthy Dairy Products, and this is an institution where you see that there are companies, there are these dairy producers working together with some leading, biotechnology scientists and nutritionists, and so they are, people are getting their doctoral degrees from there, and they are having patents, and so a lot of collaboration is going on. And yes, so you see some quite concerning images there. What's happening? Okay, so these national nutrition recommendations, they are compiled by this institute, which is a government-funded institute, and it is named National Institute for Health Development. And I'll try to use this acronym when I refer to them from now on. So NIHD. So the authors of these guidelines, they actually say, and they state that, their recommendations in Estonia are inspired by the Nordic nutrition recommendations, which were published in 2012. And as I mentioned, I've been analyzing the working version of the recommendations, and I've been having quite a hard time, getting information from this institute about what will be retained or what will be the in the final version of the guidelines. And they have actually for already some months they know what's going to be there, and the working group, the authors, have finalized it, but they just have it in language editing and in having they do a layout, and they kind of don't want to disclose any information. But it is very likely that only minor changes are going to occur in the final version regarding how they talk about animal protein and veganism. So this is quite a long document. It's almost 400 pages, and I've only analyzed some parts of it, and it also has recommendations on physical activity, and this I didn't analyze for this project. And I'm also going to look at 2 press releases that this institute released related to the publication of the guidelines. And so this is all in Estonian language, but I've translated the excerpts that I've used here into English. So I'm going to talk about 4 things here in the next slides. So first I'm going to look at how the institute, how they present their guidelines, how they frame them. Then I'm going to talk about how they insist throughout the document on the need to consume animals. And then, quite an interesting thing, how they declare animal-based diets as sustainable. And finally, I look at how they depict veganism. So why it's important to look at how the dietary recommendations are presented. So this gives an indication of how the authors position themselves and their claims, and how they intend this document to be read by their target groups. So interestingly, there's no specific methodology section. So as academics, when academics, researchers look at the work of their colleagues, they always see, okay, so where's the section where they talk about how they did the study, how they made this research, and in this document there's no such specific section. But at the same time, the authors aim to establish, or to have this document be read as part of scientific discourse. So for instance, there's a list of authors and their affiliations. So we can see that they are academics in the fields of health, nutrition, and medicine in Estonia. And so there's a very academic style in that document, and there are references, which are, almost all of them are, very kind of high, other scientific work that has been published in quite high impact international journals. So they also stress how the guidelines are evidence-based. So they use that term quite a lot, scientific evidence-based nature of the guidelines. And they seek to present these recommendations as unbiased. And the authors themselves then position themselves as experts who are very systematically relying on scientific evidence. And they also say that the process of compiling the guidelines is very transparent. But actually this contradicts very much the actual practice, because one of the key members of this team of authors is associated with this institution, the organization I mentioned before, that biotechnology center, or that I've even forgotten that name, but so yeah, where the scientists and dairy producers are working closely. So this member has clear interest in the continued exploitation of animals for capitalist gains. And this is a very obvious conflict of interest. And it actually also the declarations of interest of the members of the authors, we have not been able to obtain them. So Florian from our Vegan Society has been contacting this national development, the institution that compiled the guidelines, so they have not disclosed the declarations of interest. And yes, so this is a very obvious conflict to us, but it goes really unnoticed to the public. And so we could say that the commodification of animals remains socially invisible, and it is seen really as a neutral position, that there's a scientist who is working to improve the quality of dairy products, that this is like a very neutral position. And also we have sent inquiries to ask about other things too, but haven't received any reply. So interestingly, the guidelines, they are presented as context-bound, after being presented as evidence-based and unbiased. So, the authors say this. The recommendations should, however, consider the changing spectrum of Estonia's regional location, traditions, the actual availability of foods, Estonian large and small scale production, supply, availability, consumption patterns, and fitness habits. So as you can see, at least some of these contextual features, they are really, they can be identified as elements of the capitalist system of food production and distribution. And it is also quite striking that for readers, it is really impossible to evaluate how and to what extent and in which combination these contextual factors are used and how they shape the recommendations. So in a way, this contradicts this previously claimed evidence-based nature of the guidelines. Okay, so this is another quite striking thing, and this comes from a press release by the National Institute of Health Development. So they talk about how they interacted with the public and how they, reached out to ask for opinions for people to contribute to the making of the guidelines. And then they say this: we have received positive messages of several medical doctors and scientists competent in the topics covered, as well as recommendations to express some ideas more clearly. However, we have also received coercive demands to include surveys and studies considered as the only and absolute truth by their sender and information congruent with the website he or she is associated with. This, while it's here presented in a very anonymous way, actually we can say with quite a certainty that it refers to the inquiry sent by the Estonian Vegan Society and by Florian, actually, who is sitting right there, who has been really great help in helping me to giving me inspiration to write this research. So this statement, the latter kind of part of it refers to this inquiry sent by the Vegan Society. So sort of two opposing categories of contributors to the guidelines are then constructed. So first, there are those competent and trusted experts who are providing valuable input. And then second, there's this individual biased member of the public who's attempting to influence the compilation of the guidelines to a direction which is favorable to their own specific agenda, which is seen as to be against public interests. So in the first sentence, we have medical doctors and scientists who are then competent, and their contribution is welcome. But in the second sentence, then the professional status and the affiliation of this individual is not mentioned, is not revealed. And so he's represented as somebody, representing his or her own interests. And also, as it is depicted here, this sender, this anonymous sender, is considered quite threatening and unreasonable. And it could indeed, when we read this, it could be imagined as if it could be any individual who could have any affiliation, and the claims that might not even be related to nutrition. And also, it is quite clear that the National Institute for Health Development is not seeing the Estonian Vegan Society and vegans more broadly as legitimate, and competent stakeholders in this process. So the claims are dismissed and seen as unreasonable. Okay, so now how these guidelines then make these calls for the consumption of other animals. So one of the most striking claims, which is unheard in any nutrition recommendations anywhere else, is this. I'll read it out. It is recommended that at least 70% of all protein consumed by children and youngsters should come from high-quality protein of animal origin. For adults, this percentage is 60%. This advice stems from the clear recommendation of recent years to use protein of higher biological quality. I mean, of course, there's the obvious thing that other animals are just depicted here as high-quality protein for human consumption. And another thing to note here is that compared to the previous versions of the Estonian nutrition recommendations, which was released in 2009, so this amount of recommended animal protein has been increased. But let's look at this a bit closer. So this sentence here, the quote with the 75% of protein for children and youngsters that should come from animal sources. So what is it based on? So the authors have used 4 references, 4 documents to back up this claim. And so they've been issued by FAO, and then really respectable organizations here, European Food Safety Authority, US National Academy of Sciences, yeah? So quite prominent, respectable organizations. So they really leave the impression that this advice to include a certain percentage of animal protein comes from very clearly from these organizations. But actually, we had a closer look at these documents, and none of them contains a recommendation on the ratio of plant and animal protein in human diet. So the first 3 actually make no mention of humans needing to consume protein from animals. And the last one, it does argue for the benefits of cow's milk to people, but it is sponsored by Danone, which is a big dairy producer in Europe. Yes, so actually it is really clear that the references here are used in a very misleading way, and it is something that, the target groups of these guidelines, I know different groups in the society, most lay people, they will not really go and read these original sources, yeah? And they actually just get a clear kind of picture by reading this, that these organizations recommend this. But it's not really the case. And why these recommendations? The Estonian National Nutrition Guidelines why this has big implications is that, so these recommendations, they are like a legal, they are basis for legal acts which regulate food provision. And for instance, schools and prisons have to base their food supply really according to these guidelines. And as actually Florian, again, from our society has really pointed out, that one of the consequences could really be that legumes and plant protein sources might be excluded from school meals because the upper protein limit has been reached already by the inclusion of meat and products in the menu. So this is quite an absurd thing, of course, what can happen, but it's really realistic that following these guidelines might lead to this. Okay, so now what else is done? Throughout the document, there's animal protein is being glorified. And this is done by the repeated use of the term essential amino acid. So, so this is this expression is used only to refer to animal protein. For instance, they say milk protein contains all essential amino acids for the human body. And then they also saying these things about this thing about the eggs, yeah. So they really suggest that only animal-based foods provide adequate amino acids for the body, and then at the same time suggesting that plant foods are nutritionally inadequate, they're like incomplete proteins. And so quite interesting. So this expression, essential amino acid, you know, so this is really like an instance of the use of scientific jargon, which is used to boost the scientific legitimacy of the claim. So they are kind of exploiting this kind of common misunderstanding of the term, you know, because it's one of the terms that has really found its way from like scientific language to maybe sort of common use, and often people just use this expression, essential amino acid, often found in Estonian media without really knowing what it is. It's just usually the properties of animal-based foods are described like this. And so this is, they're kind of using that ambiguity of the term. And also this is a falsely insisting that these essential amino acids, they are saying that they can't be obtained from plant foods. And in fact, this claim has been disproved decades ago, including by some very prominent organizations working in nutrition. And it's even been found that it's not necessary to carefully combine different plant-based foods, as we have often heard that it's necessary, yeah? Okay, and also when highlighting these allegedly like beneficial properties of meat and dairy, then evidence on their negative impacts on human health have been really consistently omitted. And so there's no mention, for instance, of this WHO 2015 report, which links red and processed meats to cancer. Okay, so this is quite interesting. Then that how meat and dairy-based diets are declared as sustainable. So the guidelines have like a section which is titled, well, it talks about sustainable food consumption, which is defined as informed consumption. They are mentioning the damage caused by factory farming, but this is seen as inevitable, and ultimately it's declared as sustainable. But that's quite a long quote. I'm probably going to skip it now because I'm running out of time, but maybe we can talk about it later. And anyway, so just shortly to say that here again, like they are referring to some other studies, and they say that the conclusion is that actually when we talk about like the total sort of use of resources and the calories we get out of foods, then actually eating meat is nearly as sustainable as eating plant foods. And this is quite significant here that I want to mention that there's actually one reference provided to this rather significant claim, And it's again a study which is sponsored by this Danone, this like milk producer. And there are other limitations of this study as well. But I want to move to the final part because I'm running out of time, and I think this is really very significant as well. This concerns the depiction of veganism. So the guidelines say, the authors say, the recommendations do not need to take into account the personal preferences, attitudes, and tastes of individuals of some groups. The Estonian nutrition recommendations do not consider the details of self-restricted diets. So they're using this term self-restricted diet to refer to vegetarianism and veganism. So what is being done here? They're actually reducing food practices to individual choice, yeah? So they're divorcing these food practices from any political context. Also, there are really negative connotations of this term. So this it could imply like an eating disorder. And it really makes veganism also sound very harsh and devoid of any pleasure and really seen as unnecessary. And also, if we talk about self-restricted diets, it could really mean like any eating practice. So a lot of eating practices can be lumped together under this term. And they are not really considering any like political motivations behind those. You could talk about, somebody only drinking Coke as being on a self-restricted diet, yeah? So, and also it's a very arrogant tone here. So the people who have made this personal choice to go vegan, and then they have really taken very unnecessary risks, and therefore they do not even deserve advice on planning their diets. Yeah, so in depicting veganism, the authors have almost entirely relied on these Nordic nutrition recommendations. But there's one crucial difference. They have systematically omitted all positive aspects of plant-based diets, and they have added like ample warnings. So so for instance, they say this: if some foods are consistently excluded from the diet, some nutrient intakes might be systematically lower compared to a mixed conventional diet. This could result in deficient or inadequate intakes of essential micronutrients and other food components that are important for health. So they provide a list of nutrients that are supposedly lacking in vegan foods, and this follows a very similar pattern how they do this. So first they declare this nutrient in question as very well absorbed by animal foods, and then saying that plant-based foods only provide an inadequate supply of that nutrient. And then there are some recommendations for people on self-restricted diets to take a supplement or to consume some nutrient-enriched products or eat more of some kinds of plant foods. But however, in some cases, this recommendation on how to compensate is entirely missing. And so we don't really learn how to compensate. And then actually they say that, yeah, you can really only get this nutrient from eating animal products. So a good example of this depiction of protein is a really good example of how they, of that pattern. Yeah, so they talk about for healthy functioning, the human body must acquire protein, specifically amino acids contained in protein. And then again, they love to talk about this high quality of protein. So we need high quality protein and again, essential amino acids. So they talk about, so it's not a problem to get this amount of protein if you eat legumes, grains, seeds and nuts and a combination of them. But however, the supply of protein of high biological value assumes the inclusion of animal-based foods in the diet. Yeah, so we can't really be vegan, according to this. Okay, and I want to, this is like the last excerpt I will analyze, and it's quite long, so I'll try to read this out and then say my comments about it. So it has a lot in here. It could be analyzed a lot, but I've just said a few things. So if an adult chooses a self-restricted diet, they are entitled to do so. All forms of restricted diets without medical grounds imposed on children by parents or others are dangerous for the growing child. The problems that emerge in children are often with lifelong consequences. For example, underdevelopment in infants or toddlers caused by lack of iodine. self-restricted diets are not identical to certain temporary, shorter or longer restrictions if this is caused by illness or followed under the supervision of a medical doctor. For example, in the case of allergy towards cow's milk, goat milk can often be used. And if this too causes discomfort, alternatives should be found until the child will most likely grow out of it by around the age of 2 or 3. Therefore, there is no justification for imposing all kinds of self-restricted diets on infants and toddlers, as well as on pregnant women. It is seriously dangerous. Right, so what is here? A lot, yeah? So a self-restricted diet adopted by choice, yeah, is contrasted with a medical condition where certain food groups might be maybe temporarily eliminated from diet because of medical need. Like a plant-based diet may be taken up temporarily by doctor's order for health reasons is considered perhaps acceptable. But the same is unacceptable when we choose it for concern over the lives of other beings. So those who have chosen veganism are exhibiting very irresponsible behavior towards themselves, but even worse towards their children. And even they hint criminality here. So potentially perhaps children could be taken away from parents who exhibit such irresponsible behavior. And the demonization of vegan parents is very gendered implicitly. So here, even directly, vegan mothers are being scapegoated, and pregnant women as well. And quite interestingly, this last bit, it seems like agency is removed from pregnant women with the suggestion that the diet could be forced on them by someone else, as opposed to being an informed decision which is undertaken on their own initiative. And then this advice to use goat's milk. This is quite a desperate attempt to reinforce our reliance on animal products. And it's also really socially insensitive because plant milks by now, even in Estonia, they are cheaper and they're more available even in rural areas compared to access to goat's milk, also in terms of price. And it's quite in this insistence to consume cow's milk. When we really explore it further, it is quite implicitly, perhaps quite nationalist and racist, because it is really disregarding the fact that there are many people of non-European descent who perhaps are also increasingly coming to live in Estonia, and they cannot really digest the milk protein. They're lactose intolerant. So yeah, that's really insensitive towards these people as well. Yeah, so now coming to my conclusions. So these Estonian nutrition recommendations, they construct the consumption of other animals as necessary, natural and inevitable in many ways. I only really focused on the most obvious ways that these guidelines can be really analyzed much more in depth. And then veganism is depicted as dangerous and unsuitable for human beings. At the same time, this is done ignoring the evidence and advice of prominent international organizations. So interestingly, this glorification of animal foods is really the way it is done. It is resembling the argumentation language that is used by parties which have really clear interest in the continuing exploitation of non-human animals, such as factory farming. So therefore, it is really quite striking to find this kind of language and argumentation in this document, which is supposed to be, neutral or not really having those interests. And so my findings highlight how scientific knowledge production is really intimately tied with the animal industrial complex and supporting its interests. So that thing that, nutritional scientists who are even, associated with dairy producers, that their views are seen as a neutral position. And so, yeah, 2 more slides. So this is really, as I've already mentioned, quite a powerful text. It's not no kind of innocent document. So this has really profound consequences. So based on this, public institutions will compile the menus. Medical doctors advise their patients, and including children and pregnant women will get advice based on this. So also the food pyramids, other kind of leaflets, everything is going to be done on the basis of these guidelines. And then vegans, including vegan parents, will receive no support from the medical system and other public institutions they interact with, such as schools and kindergartens, and maybe also ostracized. Of course, then many people who actually are compassionate towards animals and they might want to adopt veganism, they might not do so, because if they consistently get these messages that it is unsafe for you, and if doctors tell them this, they might not go vegan. The glorification of animal protein here then upholds the expectation of the meat and dairy industry to keep receiving subsidies, big subsidies from the state, which they are already receiving. So they can make demands based on this. So, so the speciesism is really entangled with capitalist interests, and this remains not only unchallenged but actively reproduced. And this has really disastrous consequences for animals and environment and health. And so these dietary guidelines, in fact, they legitimate and they endorse our violence towards other animals. So I think that this discourse, which is painting human consumption of other animals as inevitable and silencing and downplaying the cost of this while claiming to represent public health interest, it must be really publicly and urgently challenged. And we must really ask critical questions. So how, for instance, how do science and business support each other in creating this knowledge that is used to advance speciesist values and capitalize on the lives of other animals? So how does this entanglement remain socially invisible? And what are some effective ways of challenging these dominant forms of knowledge? Also, I would be really interested to know what has been the experience of other countries in this. And finally, I really would want to thank again Florian from our Vegan Society, who you can approach with questions too about this. So thank you very much.